this is the second video in a multi-video tutorial on how to draw things in Adobe Illustrator. I'm covering all the basics and everything that you really need to know to use Adobe Illustrator. So after you complete all these videos, you should be pretty confident and pretty able to do just about everything that you need to in Adobe Illustrator. Now I recommend when you're watching this video, to have Adobe Illustrator open and to be doing these things alongside me. And so don't just watch it, just actually do it. If you haven't seen the first video, I recommend going back and watching it. There's probably a lot of things in there that you're not aware of, even if you've used Adobe Illustrator for a while. So the first video was about creating things, creating your workspace, creating a new document, saving and exporting, drawing shapes, that sort of thing. This video is going to be about taking the objects that you've already drawn and manipulating them and moving them and arranging them and changing their appearance. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to work with a widely used tool in Adobe Illustrator, and it's called the gradient. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a rectangle, and I'm just going to draw it about like that. And I'm going to put a black outline. It's a black fill, it doesn't really matter because we're going to be changing it. So we're going to apply a gradient to this object. So I'm going to go over here to gradient right over here. If you don't see it over on this side, then you need to go up to window and go down to gradient and slide it over. So I'm going to click on gradient, and let's just start with the linear gradient. Now the first thing that happened is it actually applied the linear gradient on the stroke. This happens almost every time. So what you need to do is make sure, so there's two little squares here. There's a fill square, and that modifies the fill of the object. And then there's the stroke. This is the line on the outside. Whichever box is overlaying the other tells you which it's going to modify. So if I click the linear gradient, I'm modifying the stroke and not the fill. So let's go back and make it black, and then you just click on the other box, and that puts overlay. And so now I'm going to be modifying the fill. I can't count the number of times that I've done it, including this making this video. I just did it. Okay, so this applies a linear gradient. You can now modify the linear gradient by sliding over these what it calls sliders, and you just click and hold it and drag it, and that modifies it. So you'll see that the gradient is filled up to here, and then it becomes black, and then it's solid black from this point forward. Now you can add new set points or new sliders if you put your mouse right below this gradient bar. You see a little plus sign, you click. What's going to do, it's going to apply the slider right at that position. It's going to take that color at that position. The reason why it does this is it doesn't want to modify the appearance of the object just by clicking on this thing, because that would make things complicated. So now, but you can have a new point that you can modify. Now notice that when I make changes here, you can see them over there. Okay, so you can add new points. You can change the color of those points. So I can double click on this, and I can make it black, or I can make it purple. It doesn't really, any color that you pick, it'll work with any color that you pick. Now if you choose another color and go back here to this kind of color palette, now you have all sorts of options to modify the color, and you can change the color scheme. Right now it's CMYK, which is kind of printing, the print color scheme, as if you're going to print it on a piece of paper. If you click up here, you can do RGB. You can do, I like working with HSB because you can change the hue and saturation. I just find that easier. A lot of times that's how I like to modify the colors. But any color that you want. You can also use the color picker. Click on this, and you can actually pull from the gradient that you're using. So I can kind of point it right there, and it's going to change that color to what it was at that position. Okay. Now you might not see this little gradient bar on the object itself. So the way, so if I were to click just with the direct selection tool, you can see that it's no longer there. I can just click on the edit gradient and that will show this bar that's right here. Now I can change the angle of this gradient either by going over here and modifying it to a specific angle, so I can click 45 and it moves it to a 45. I can also go up here to this this point at the right until I see that rotation, and I can rotate it any way that I want. Okay. Now let me make this a little sharper so you can kind of see the angle that it's going. And I'm by no means advocating for these particular colors. I'm just using them for illustration. Okay, so I mean I can make this, you can make, let's change this to black, and then so you can kind of get a nice little effect. Okay, and of course you can change these set points here on the object itself. Anyways, you can, if you alternate, then you can make, kind of a metallic looking object. Maybe if I make this a little more, less gray, I can make it, less black. Then I can make it look metallic. I can add some blue to make it look like steel, or some brown to make it look a little more bronze. Whatever. Well, this is a nice effect for, pathway, like molecular pathways or whatever. You can put the like protein kinase A and make it kind of smaller. Okay. One thing to keep in mind is that as you rotate the object, it's going to rotate that gradient with it. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the radius, or the radial gradient. So I'm going to hold the shift and drag down. Now notice that it has that same gradient that I applied to the previous object. So the next object's going to carry over that exact same gradient, but we don't want that particular gradient. So we're going to, to remove these sliders, you click and hold and drag them away, and it causes them to disappear. All right, so I'm sliding this all the way over. Let's make this black and bring this towards the center, and let's make it radial gradient. Okay, so the radial gradient is a really cool tool to make things look three-dimensional, like a three-dimensional sphere. Before I go into it, let me show you how to make kind of a three-dimensional cylinder. So I'm gonna make an ellipse. Sorry, I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. I'm gonna make a rectangle. Like that. And then I'm gonna apply the linear gradient again. Click on this, right click, arrange, bring to front. Okay, and then we're going to modify these points here. Let's see, let's actually add a point. Actually, the easiest thing to do is to click on this, hold Alt key, drag it down, something like that. Highlight these two, and you can actually use the shape builder tool. Click down. That's gonna change the fill to something a little more simple. We're gonna add that linear gradient back, and then there's a cylinder right there. Okay, so you can use the gradient to create three-dimensional objects. So it's the same thing as for the radial gradient. This is a spherical looking object. It would be as if the light is coming from your nose and shining onto this this ball. You can change the position of that light source, or the start point of the gradient, by clicking on Edit Gradient. And you just take this and kind of move it up to the top right. The vast majority of the time I do this, I offset it just a little bit. So if you click away, you change the center point of the gradient. So I'm going to Control Z and click away. So that looks like a three-dimensional ball right there. So that works, you know, pretty fantastic. You can change the black to maybe a little lighter, and that looks nice. So it's a really easy way of making something look 3D. And so Illustrator has the 3D capability. If you go down here, you can have all sorts of 3D things that you can do to create actual 3D objects, but that's not a strong point. Adobe Illustrator is not very powerful in making 3D objects, so sometimes it's best just to work with, you know, try to create things that look 3D. Okay. Now you can do all sorts of things with this edit gradient. You can actually change the height of the gradient. You can rotate it as well, and you can change the positions as well. You can so you can change the positions of the sliders. You can also make this thing larger or smaller. We'll go back to the original. Oh, see, if you click away, it changes that center point. Sometimes it's kind of annoying. But if you click on the selection tool, that gets you out of the edit gradient. The last thing I want to talk about with gradients is the freeform gradient. So I click on that. It's what it does. It's a really cool tool. You have these little set points on a two-dimensional plane. So as before, you had the set points along the gradient bar. This has the gradient set points on the two-dimensional plane. And what it does is it samples the colors from the artwork that you're drawing to kind of estimate what you would like. So everything here is in gray, so that's why all of these colors are gray. Now you can just double click on this and change the color to whatever you want. It really creates really cool effects. I love this thing. It's almost difficult to make something look bad. You know, it's really nice for making backgrounds and that sort of thing. So I wanted to show you that. There's also you can play around with let's click on this. Click edit gradient, and you can do lines. So like a line, you would connect this point with that point, and then you can kind of loop it around or do whatever you want. It just does some really cool things. Anyways, I love that. That's a new tool that they've just added. Okay, so let's move forward. The next thing is copying and pasting objects. So for instance, if I want to copy this circle here, I can hold the Alt key, click on my right mouse button and drag, then release my left mouse button and then release the Alt key. It's important that you release the left mouse button first before releasing the Alt button. Okay, there's one effect that I want to talk to you about that's similar to the gradient, and I just want to mention it to you because you probably will be using it quite a few times, and that's called the blur effect. So I'm going to create just a ellipse. Let's kind of make so this, what I would do is if I want to create a drop shadow for this. Now you can create a drop shadow. Let me go ahead and show that to you. If I click Effect and click Stylize and then do Drop Shadow, and this is, you know, a drop shadow. You can see, and click OK. So you can see that it applies a drop shadow. It's really good for text and all that sort of thing. But what I'm looking for is I want to see a shadow just below this object, and I can use the blur effect to do that. So I'm going to change this to black, and I'm going to actually let me draw something that's the same size. Actually, I'm just going to modify this so that it's the same size, and I'm going to put it about like that. Right click, arrange, send to back, and we're going to talk about arranging here in a little bit. So it already kind of looks like a shadow, but I want to add a little bit of a blur to it. click Effect, Blur, Gaussian Blur. That's too much. I'm going to slide this over. So just to give it a soft edge, and click OK. And so there's a shadow, and I've kind of offset a little bit because the light source is coming up from the top. So the blur effect can do more than just make shadows, but it can do a lot of sort of things, and I think it's an important tool that I think you should have in your toolkit or tool belt, or at least know how to use. The next thing is we're going to talk about object ordering. So in order to bring this object, send an object to the back, like I showed it, you right click, arrange, send to back, or you can send it to the front to bring it up to the front. Another thing is just to kind of show you, let's say I want to bring it in between those two objects. I hold Control and click the left bracket, and that sends it further back in the workspace. So and if you can bring it forward by holding Control and clicking the right bracket. Okay. Another thing that can be done is if your default is to draw things in front. If I were to draw a circle right now, it would draw it in front of these other spheres, or these other objects. If I were to click on the draw behind, then whatever object I select, I'm going to draw behind it. So if I click on this object and make a circle, notice how it's behind this object but in front of this one. Now if I were to click on this object and then draw the circle again, notice it draws it behind that one. If I were to click it the other direction, so now I'm drawing in front, and I click on this object and draw, it draws in front of everything. So the tools are a little bit different. I think that's actually kind of strange. I think that it should have drawn just in front of this other object that I've selected, just to copy the effect of the draw behind. But the draw behind mode is kind of unique. You only draw behind the object that you've selected. So that's an important thing. But again, I can just use the Control and left bracket and to move things back into space. You'll be using that actually quite a bit. So that's object orienting. Now, there's also a thing called grouping. So I can make these a part of the same group. I do a little selection. So I select both of those objects, hold Control, press G. That groups these objects. Now if I click on any one object, I select both. Now the reason why I'd want to do that is sometimes you want to align objects accordingly. Like if I want to align these two spheres with that one, I select everything and I align, and it keeps the position correct in the group to align everything. If I didn't have this in a group, right click, ungroup. Now if I select those three objects and I click to align, notice that they're now on top of each other. So the grouping is useful for making sure everything kind of moves together within that group. So let's talk about the alignment tools. So to talk about alignment, I'm just going to draw some lines and then we're going to align them in different ways. So I'm going to hold the Shift key to kind of draw some different sized lines. This is just to illustrate the purpose of the alignment tool. And the alignment tool is very similar to how it works in PowerPoint. So but just in case you haven't worked with it in PowerPoint, I definitely want to show you how to use it here in Illustrator, because the alignment tool is very useful and you will use it all the time. I know I use it all the time. Okay, so let's dig into it. So I'd like to align every one of these objects, every one of these lines, so that the center point of each line is along the midpoint of everything that I selected. So I want them all to align right across here. That's really easy. You just click on vertical align center. You can also go over here to align and click on vertical align center. So let's click up here. So notice how everything is in a line. So this is aligning to the selection. Now, let me Control Z. Another way you can align is to align, let me zoom out so you can see this, is you can go over here to the top and you click on Align to Artboard. So now if I click Align, Vertical Align Center, it aligns everything to the center of the page. So this is really good for, making a title page or that sort of thing. Let's Control Z. And the next thing you can do is align to a key object. So if I were to click, let's say, this object right here, and then, so now that it's in kind of a more solid color, see, so it's a much more solid blue. Now if I were to click Vertical Align Center, it moves all those objects so that it aligns to the center of this object. So that's aligning to a key object. And you can see up here that there's a key to indicate that I'm aligning to a key object. So this is really important, like if you're making graphs and that sort of thing, and you align your numbers to a specific number. It's definitely a useful tool. Play around with it to make sure you can master that, because it will save you a lot of time, I promise. The next thing you might want to do is you may want to distribute these things evenly. Notice how it's really a large gap here and a narrow gap here. So if you click on Horizontal Distribute Center, notice how it spaces everything evenly. It might be more easier if I align everything to the top. So what this is going to do is going to take the topmost tip of every object that you've selected, and it's going to align everything to the topmost point. So I'm going to click on that. It brings everything to the top, and now you can see that they're evenly spaced. So you can do this for, axes, for graphs, and that sort of thing. Okay, or make a ruler. There's a lot of things you can do with this. One trick is, let's Control Z. If I were to drag this down. Let me actually make the same size object. Okay. So if I were to highlight all these objects and I were to click Horizontal Distribute Center and then a Vertical Distribute Center. Okay, let's change these objects around. So the order at which you draw them is actually really important. So let's highlight all those. And then now let's do Horizontal Distribute Center and then Vertical Distribute Center. And so what it does is it puts it all along a diagonal. So that may be useful. So so that's all about aligning objects. There's also important things like if you were to click on this one object, you get distribute spacing, and you can change how you can specify the distance of each spacing of the object. So if I were to do 0.5, that's 0.05, sorry, 0.5, and then click Horizontal Distribute, that specifies everything to be a half an inch. So this, you could make an actual ruler that if you print it out, it would be half an inch per division. Okay, so the next section is going to be all about text. And of course, Adobe Illustrator, one of the main reasons why it was created is to make text, and very flashy text or very eye-catchy or captivating text. So there is plenty of options for doing text, and you can save yourself a lot of time if you understand how text works in Adobe Illustrator, because there's a lot to it. So let's get started. I'm going to go over here to, so you can change. So the default is actually Myriad Pro. So if you were to click on text type tool, the font family, or what is called the font family, is probably going to say Myriad Pro, and that's kind of the Adobe Illustrator or the Adobe format. If you click this down arrow, you have all sorts of other options. There's an infinite number, and you can probably download more fonts if you don't see what you need. So you just click on Arial. That's kind of nice because it's not capped, and I think it looks nice. Now each font has all sorts of aspects to it, so it can be regular, italicized, bold, bold italics, all that sort of thing. And then of course here's the font size. Now there are two main types of type tools. If you click and hold, you'll see a whole lot of other options. I'm not going to really get into any of those. Maybe a type on path tool. We'll talk about that as well. But the main thing is type tool, area type tool. Okay, what's the difference between these two? Well, the type tool, or the point type tool is what it's called, is if you just click on the screen, it creates a text box. And the thing about this text box is I can keep typing and it will expand the text box. Enter. If I press enter, it will do a carriage return. I don't know if that's how you spell carriage. Hopefully it's not wrong. Okay, so that's the point type tool. It'll keep on expanding the text box along the horizontal all the way, and it will go all the way to the end of the document until you press enter, and then it will do a carriage return, and then you can type the next line. An area type is a little different. If I click on the type tool, and this time instead of just clicking on the screen, I click and hold. Now what I do is I specify a space for which I want to type in, and it's going to wrap that text accordingly. So if I were to just start typing here, if I keep on typing, it will wrap the text. Okay, so it keeps that text within this box. Okay, and it won't go beyond the bottom edge of the box. So the text, there's more text here, you just can't see it. Now if I were to click on the selection tool and I were to expand this box, you can then see the remaining text. Of course, if you make it smaller, you won't be able to see it. Okay. And then notice if I move on the right hand side, it'll change the wrapping this way. Okay, it will wrap the text and change the alignment accordingly. That is completely different than the point type tool. If you go up here at the top, if I were to expand and contract, notice it squeezes the text. So that's quite a bit different behavior. So that's a major problem that I see in illustrations, is you'll see text that people have modified it this way to kind of fit it into a space, and they don't really notice that they've actually squeezed this text, because you won't be able to tell it by any of the numbers or metrics up here. Okay, you'll only be able to tell just by looking at it. So just be careful when working with the point type tool. They're both important, and I use both of these text objects all the time, just for different reasons. So if you're just labeling a figure, then I'd recommend the point type tool. But if you're creating like legends for a figure or large bodies of text, then I recommend using the area type tool. Now, there's other important things that I want to talk about with the text. The important thing is there's a whole lot of other features for the text, and let me get into those features of the text before I get into some of the kind of the best practices. So let's just I can keep on typing, or I can keep typing. Let's just use that. Okay, so of course you can change the properties of this text. You're not limited to changing all of the text. So if I were to just click on the whole box, if I make this larger or smaller, that's going to modify everything. But I'm not limited to that. I can double click on the text box and I can highlight this keep, and I can make just that smaller or larger. Now notice if I click on the selection tool, and whenever I click on the whole text object, you don't see a font size anymore, and that's because it knows that the selection that you have has multiple types, multiple size fonts. Of course, if you go over here and you click 11, it'll change all of them the same, so that they become the same size font. Now there's a whole bunch of features that you can modify with this text. If I click on the character panel, there's all sorts of things you can do. You can change the width of the text, you can change the height along above the baseline. You can there's so many things that you can do. One thing you can do is you can do superscripts or subscripts. So let's say I have calcium 2+. Okay, I can make this a superscript by highlighting that 2+, going up to character, and clicking on superscript. Or I can make it a subscript. So let's make it a superscript. Okay, so let's make another text box, and I'm gonna type over here, wait a second. Now this is the same size as this. See, 11-point font. This is 11-point font. But look, it's much smaller. What happened? Well, the last thing I did was make this a superscript. So Adobe Illustrator applies the appearance of the properties to the next thing that you did. So when I created a new text box, and if I click on character, guess what? It's as a superscript. So that's something you want to be careful with. It happens a lot where you're writing a new text box and it happens to be in a superscript mode. So let's unclick that, and now you can see it's the same size. Now you can also change the alignment. So if I click over here to the align center, you notice that nothing didn't really seem like anything changed, but things did change. If I were to click on this and I press enter and I start typing, notice that it's along the center. Now if you have a single line of text, you're not really going to see the center align, but there's an important time when, even if you only have a single line, that you need to use the center align text, and that is if you know that you want this text to be in the center of a selection. So let me bring up a circumstance. I'm going to draw an axis. I'm going to hold the shift key, draw a line this way. Now look what happened. When I drew this line, it doesn't have the default for Adobe Illustrator is to draw a black line, but it's not. It's no appearance at all, and that's because the previous object that I drew has a fill, but it doesn't have a stroke. Okay, what does that mean? Well, when I click on this text, notice that there's a black fill, but there's no outline. So what would happen if I add a black outline? Look, it makes it really obscured. And the reason why is because it actually add a black outline on the outside of this. So if I click on this and make this red, then make this a smaller point, you can see that it actually adds an outline to the object. So anytime you want, but if you don't want that particularly, then make the outside as a no fill. So you actually make the stroke as a no color or none, and then add the fill. So the fill is how you change the color of the text. But you keep in mind that when you draw a line after messing with text, after selecting text, then it's not going to have any outline. So just go over here and make it black. So I'm going to draw another line, just to illustrate a point that I want to make. So let's say I have a bar graph, something like that. That happens. You might actually accidentally make a random text box. That happens all the time. So let's make this control. this drug one. Where's drug? Okay, so the default actually to make it as a left align. Okay, so let's make it as a left align, and I'm gonna align these objects as best that I can. In fact, I might even let's I clicked on this, hold Shift key, clicked again, that selects these two objects. I'm gonna click again to make this a key object, and then I'm gonna click horizontal align center. Click over here, hold Shift, click on this one, click again to make this a key object, horizontal align center. So everything's aligned, and actually I'm going to highlight those two things and do vertical align center. Now it looks great. And you think maybe that I did a good job here. Everything's aligned, it looks great, but if I click on this, it's aligned to the left. Well, why is that a problem? You know, it looks like it's supposed to. Well, the thing where it gets to be a problem is if I want to change this. Maybe I don't want this to be control, maybe I want it to be pre-test or pre. Now it's off-centered. So you think, oh, well, that's not a big deal. I just re-center it. Well, the problem is if you have to do that, you know, maybe you have to do that. Maybe you have 10 bar graphs, and all the 10 bar graphs, you labeled them as control and you didn't label them as pre. So you'd have to realign every single time. The best thing to do is to click Align Center, and that aligns the text to the center. Align Center. So now you notice that it moved over. That's because it changed the relative position of the object, or the reference position of that one object, but we won't get into that. Just know that you hold Shift, click again, so that you make this key object and center it. So I'm going to click on this one, hold Shift, and then make this key object. Now that it's a center aligned text, now I can modify it to whatever I want, and it stays centered. I can change the font size, and then no matter what I do, it stays aligned to the center. It wouldn't do that if it's aligned to the left, because now the width of the text box changes. So if you know that you want your text to be aligned center on a box, go ahead and click Align Center of the text. It'll save you a lot of time in the future. Okay, so the Type Area tool has the same features. You can align to the center, align to the right. There's align to the left. You can also make it justified by clicking on the paragraph. And now you have the alignments. So now I can make it justified. You can also do a leading edge or a trailing edge or a leading edge. Notice that this is the paragraph. So this is you're changing the paragraph format. So this indentation here is true for both of these paragraphs. Okay, you can make this 0. There's, again, a whole bunch of things that you can do. You can do a space before the paragraph, so you notice that I'm adding the space here. And then space after, same thing. Okay, now the other thing that you might find useful is creating a margin. So let's say this is a legend for a poster. Let me click away. So I'm going to make something like this. Let me flip these. Okay, so this is kind of the box for the poster, and I want this text to be, I don't want it to meet up right with this line. I want to have a margin. So I'm going to click on the text box, go over here to area type, and then I could change the inset spacing. Let's change it to 0.25. Well, that's maybe a little extreme. Like click area type. Let's do 0.125. Okay. So now it adds a margin along each of the sides, and so that's, you know, really handy to do. The other thing you can do is, to make this, Control Z. So I'm going to double click on it. And actually, let me click the whole thing the whole text box. And I'm going to change it to, I don't know, 11 type font. The next thing you can do is make, click on the area type tool and change the number of columns. So see, add a second column. So that can be handy. You can actually add rows too. That's really nice. So there's just a whole bunch of features that you can play around with. But those are the kind of the more important features that I think you will use. Another important feature you can use with the area type tool is you can change the vertical position. So I can click center. So now it centers along the whole text box. Okay. Now, there's a whole lot of things you can do with text to make it kind of jazzy or fancy. You know, maybe you're making a flyer or something like that. So let's play around with that. So I'm going to click over here. I'm going to do just the point type tool, and I'm going to, let's say, neuroscience. Okay. Let's make this look fancy. So I'm going to make it larger. Now let me zoom out so I can see it in reference to the whole piece of paper. Okay, and let's change it to, I don't know, something like this. And we can, you know, add a border. So, you know, I already showed you this. Make this black and make this blue. And so that looks nice. You can also add a gradient to it. So let me copy this. So I'm going to hold Alt, drag it over. Okay, to add a gradient, you actually have to do what's called you have to expand the object. They expand, so you go up to Object and you click Expand, and what it's going to do is it's going to convert all of this text object into a bunch of shapes. So I'm going to click Expand, click OK. So now each one of these are individual shapes. Adobe Illustrator no longer sees this as text. It just sees this as shapes now. Up here, it sees it as a text. See, there's an underline indicating that's a text. So what now that allows us to do is to change the fill accordingly to a gradient. So I'm going to make this a linear gradient. And I can change the angle. I'll make it look, you know, something like that. So it's kind of a metallic look. So it's kind of looks kind of fancy. Let's make this. Anyways, so you can do that to make it kind of look fancy. You can add a drop shadow. So go up to Effect, go to Stylize, Drop Shadow. Maybe not so extreme. You know, something like that. Let's make it a little less. Let's actually go over here to Appearance, click on Drop Shadow, and 0.06, 0.06, and we will reduce, oh well, what's that? 0.03. Okay. So that makes it look nice. You can make it look 3D. So let's hold Alt key and drag this over. Let's make this let's do no black outline, and we'll go up to Effect, and we can do 3D materials. We can do extrude and bevel, so you can make it look 3D. You can also add a custom fill. So let's do that. So hold Alt and drag it down. Okay, so let's make a custom fill. Let's see. Let's draw a whole bunch of neurons. Let's try that. So I'm going to click on this. Click on the polygon tool. So I'm going to hold Shift so that it's extends it like that. And we'll make this no outline, make it a black fill. And this will also show you how to do a custom fill. So kind of for multiple reasons that I'm doing this. And so we're going to click. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill it with a whole bunch of neurons. So I want to draw a neuron here, and I'm going to add it to the swatches, and then I'm going to apply that swatch to the word. So I'm going to click on the ellipse tool, go over here, let's do kind of a bright green, and draw it like this, put it in the center. And I'm going to use the pencil tool. And I'm going to change this so that it's on the, so that I'm drawing with a stroke. So I'm just going to click on, draw something like that. That's way too thick. That's 1 point. Let's expand this out. Okay, that's fine. Okay, let's change this to 2.5, 0.25. Okay. Click on this, and then I want to change the stroke to round cap and a round join. Now, the important thing with the pencil tool, first click on the selection tool, and then click on the pencil tool. So, and I'm going to show you why you do that. So, if I were to modify this line here, I can just, now that I've just drawn it, I can actually just draw again, and notice how I'm modifying that line, which is kind of cool. So but what I want to do is rather draw a branch along this line. Well, because I clicked on the selection tool and then clicked on the pencil tool, I can hold the control button and it moves me to the previous tool that I had. So notice that I go from pencil to selection tool. Now I can click away and deselect that line that I drew, and that allows me to draw a branch. So it's kind of a trick to quickly draw branches. Another trick is to draw it on another branch that you haven't just recently drawn, so it doesn't think that you want to modify the line. Okay. So now we're going to take this, select all of that, and then we're going to click on swatches and we're going to drag it over and then release. Now, important thing is click away so you don't have this selected anymore. Now I'm going to double click on this new pattern swatch that I've added. I'm going to go over here to tile type and then click hex by column. Notice how it makes it much tighter, and just kind of cancel out. Now I'm going to click on this neuroscience, and I'm going to click on the fill. Now notice it applied it to the outline. We don't want to do that because it considers this just as a color, really. And it just copies this pattern along to fill it. So let's click on the fill rather than the outline or the stroke, and now click on it. So now I've added neurons, or you can think of it as microglia or any type of cell, into the as the fill. Another thing you can do is you can trace the letters with neurons. So that'd be kind of fun. Let's do that. I'm going to type in neuroscience again. Science. Let's make it large. This time I'm going to change a thin font. So like this Eros light. Notice how it's very almost pencil thin. And then I'm going to go, but what I need to do is I need to convert this into lines. I don't want to have it as a fill like it is up here. I want it actually as a line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rasterize it and then use the image tracing tool. So I'm going to go up to Object. I'm going to click on Rasterize. I want the transparent background. Click OK. Now I want to go up here to Image Trace. And then go up to Image Trace Panel. And I want to make it as strokes and not as fills. And I'm going to change the width of the stroke until I get a complete looking lettering. So again, what I'm doing is I'm converting the text objects into lines. So now if I click on this and I click expand, these are individual lines and they're not fills. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to create a brush. And we're going to go into brushes in a lot more detail in the next video, but this is going to be really quick. So I'm going to draw a neuron again. Okay. And we can do it, let's do it, I don't know. Let's do it red, sure. Actually, let me flip this. And then let me draw a neuron. First, let me click away. And now I'm going to draw with the pencil. I'm going to change this to a stroke and not a fill. I'm going to hold the Shift key to draw a straight line. And then I'm going to let it deviate. Let's change that a little bit. Okay. Now I'm going to hold the Control to click away. I'm holding the space key to pan. Okay. Now I'm going to select everything. I'm going to hold Shift to unselect that. I'm going to go to Appearance, Stroke, and I'm going to do a round cap and a round joint. And I haven't spent a whole lot of time on this. Let me draw one more. Now I'm going to hold the I key to copy this appearance here. So I'm going to select everything. And this time I'm going to go to Brushes. I'm going to drag it over. And I'm going to click Pattern Brush. Click OK. Then click OK. This may be too big here. Let me highlight everything. It may not come out right because this is really large relative to this. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, it looks quite a bit strange. Let me double click on this and let's scale it down. Click OK. Apply to strokes. And we have created a whole bunch of neurons that are connected to each other. Now, this can be anything, and we're going to create a whole, I'm going to have a whole large section on using the applying brush to things. So that's just one quick introduction to that. Okay, so that is, well, there's a few other things. Let's talk about erasing and cutting objects and combining objects. So let's say I have a series of circles. Let's make it green. I'm just going to copy it. Actually, let me make a specific object. Let's see. Make a rectangle here. Okay. So if I want to combine these two objects, say I want this to be a whole object and I don't want to have it divided like you see here. What I can do is go over here to the pathfinder and I can click Unite. And see, it combines that objects together. Another way of doing it, Control Z, so now I have it separated, is to go over here to the Shape Builder tool. And if I notice how it fills in with dotted lines different portions of this object, these two objects. So this is everything excluding the other object. This is kind of the merge between these two objects, and this is everything excluding the object here. So if I click and drag and holding my left mouse button, I can combine these two objects here. And all I have to do is create a single line. So I just draw it like that, and it will combine it that way. That's doing it kind of manually. Another way to do it is just to click on the Pathfinder and click Unite. And now the trick here is, so let's look a little bit detailed. If I click on this to make it blue, highlight both objects. If I click Unite, it's going to combine those two objects even though they don't look the same. However, they don't have the same fill. It'll combine it anyways. If I go over here and click Pathfinders and do Merge, it won't combine those two objects, you see? So that is an important distinction there. The other thing you can do is you can click on Divide. Now what that does is it takes all of the merge between these two objects, and let me right click on Group, and it divides it up into different components. Okay, so that can be a very useful tool. Another thing is, going back to the original right here, is I can subtract the front, minus front. So now it just took that object that it was and it kind of cut out a hole where that object was. So this is useful for, let's say, if I click on this, hold the Alt key and drag it away, do something like that. I can highlight this and then click minus front, and it turns it into kind of half moon shape. So that's useful maybe if you want to do shading or that sort of thing. Okay, so the next thing is the eraser tool. So let's play around with the eraser tool. So I'm going to have multiple lines here. So I'm going to draw these lines, something like that. Now this can be like recording traces or whatever. This is mainly to get the principle behind here. So one way of erasing the tool, say I want to trim these all so that they're all aligned properly. Okay. One way is to use the eraser tool. So you can click on the eraser tool and press enter. You probably have it as a rounded object, kind of like this. Okay, maybe it's a little smaller, but you can change the roundness. You can make it 0, and so that's a flat line. You can change the angle of that line, so let's just make it 90. And you can change the size, how big you want it. So let's click OK. So what you can do is if you select these objects, you can just move that eraser along, and it's going to cut those objects accordingly. Now it's only the eraser only erases objects that you've selected. So look at the neuroscience up there. Now it looks like it's erasing it, but when I release, it returns. Okay. Now the eraser tool is really useful. I mean, you can also use the direct selection tool. So click the direct selection tool, and then you can kind of select these points here and press delete. Notice that whenever I clicked on that, it deleted much more than I really want it to do. Now the eraser tool is different. It won't do that. Using the direct selection tool is going to delete the anchor points. So it's going to delete that anchor point, and if it deletes that anchor point, then it's going to retract that line to the previous anchor point. So it's going to end right here. See? So that's maybe, and notice that it's not quite aligned anymore. I mean, this is still jagged. The eraser tool is going to do kind of the same. It's going to do something different. It's actually going to create an anchor point at that one spot. But notice it's not perfect. See that there's still a little space from where I erased. It also kind of tweaks the objects a little bit to get it to fit on that erasing, that point that I erased to. It does kind of modify the traces, these lines just a little bit. The other thing you can do to make it exactly a knife cut. So let's take a look. First of all, let me move these objects much closer together so you can see what's going on. So I'm going to highlight these objects here. Let me make it a little thicker. Now I'm going to use this eraser tool. So, and let's change this to this appearance to something like that. So one thing that you can notice here is if I were to erase, let's go about like that. Notice it still didn't erase it perfectly, and if you look at these lines, the fill or the stroke is kind of tilted at this point, and sometimes these little edges go beyond your box that you're looking for. The best thing to do is to use a clipping mask. So to do a clipping mask, I'm going to use a rectangle tool. I'm just going to draw a rectangle to about where I want to trim it. And I'm going to highlight everything, click again on this top object, right click, and say make clipping mask. Now what that does is it makes a perfect cut. Now the remainder traces are still there. So this is really nice for if you have like recording traces and stuff like that, where you may not know exactly where you want to trim it, and you want it to be trimmed, really well. The clipping mask is a really good option. And I know a lot of people are kind of afraid. I know in the beginning I was afraid to use clipping mask, but they really are very handy. So if I want to modify these lines inside here, see right now it's inside the clipping mask. And you say, well, how in the world do I select this object? Well, one thing you can do is you can use the direct selection tool. Actually, you can use the group selection tool. And now you can click on that one object. Now what this does is this clipping mask, everything beyond the clipping mask you can't see. Now the line still exists, you just can't see it. So you can move this here, and that it makes a perfect clip. It divides that, cuts that object, or crops that object exactly where you want it. Now you can use the group selection tool. You can also use the selection tool and just kind of double click until you get inside, and now you can modify each of these lines or select some of the lines and move them. Now keep in mind, see, that you can also modify the clipping mask. So if I just click over on the outside, I can change this clipping mask now. So this allows you to modify exactly where you want it to be cut. Okay, so we've covered, one last thing is the scissors tool. If you want to cut this, let's say you have a curve. Let's release clipping mask. That removes that clipping mask that we had. Now let's say I have this line here, and I want to create a whole bunch of vertical lines. Okay, that'll be good enough. Let me a line to the bottom, and then horizontal distribute center. Now I want to cut these vertical lines so that they follow this path. So I can use the scissors. So click and hold on the eraser tool, and then you'll see the scissors tool. And if you have these selected, first have the vertical line selected, and I just go along this until I see that it meets with that path. Just be sure you have it to where it's positioned on the vertical path first and then click. That makes sure that you're, so don't do it this way, okay, because then you might cut this line instead of the vertical line. Just go along the vertical path, go along the path that you want to cut. Okay, so now, so we've done a lot of things. I've shown you all about text and how to modify text. I can show you how to do fancy text like you see up here. I've shown you how to apply a brush stroke to text so you can make kind of fancy look text that way. I've shown you how to take objects and divide objects or merge objects. I've shown you how to erase portions of those objects and how to trim the objects along this path here, which might become useful for you. I have shown you how to do gradients, radial gradients, linear gradients, freeform gradients. And so there's a lot of material in here. And so the next thing that the next video is gonna be kind of putting it all together and doing kind of more complex work, and applying all these principles that we've learned in this video.